And so blasting materials, all blasting materials have a characteristic of friability. We mainly talk about crushed glass, steel grit, and aluminum oxide, and but there's way more blast medias out there. So you can use, we always are talking about grit, but you can actually also use like shot or bead, which is rounded and does more of a peening. It will still clean, but it's more of a peening, where grit is actually angular and pointed, so it actually removes material a lot better. Instead of hitting and bouncing off, it actually kind of hits it. Instead of bouncing right back, it kind of hits in and is helping remove material. But yeah, like there's coal slag, garnet. Some people still use sand, but not very regularly, because there's some environmental issues with using sand. Soda, walnuts, corn cobs, and so there's all these different kind of blast media, and there's more that I'm not thinking of right now, but they all have different friabilities, and friability for blasting is a really good material property to look at to figure out, how much will this grit or media or shot that I select hurt the substrate that I'm blasting. So if you're blasting a really thin piece of metal, let's say a thin piece of aluminum, because aluminum's pretty soft in comparison to regular steel, you would want to use a pretty high friability blast media, because if you got a really thin, soft piece of metal that you're trying to blast, you don't want to damage it, you don't want to warp it, you don't want to blast a hole through it. So then you want to use a blast media that's really high in friability. And we don't talk about that material property much, and I don't hear manufacturers or sales reps talk about that very much, because it's more on the technical side. People just know, like, oh, crushed glass or walnut shells or corn cobs are not very aggressive, and so that we would use that on lighter weight materials that are really thin, that we think might we don't want to damage or worry about damaging. But the reason why, the scientific, the engineering behind it, and is that it's because those blasting materials have higher friability. They break down when they have the impact, and the blast media is breaking down in comparison to the substrate. So the substrate that's really thin and soft is actually okay, because we're using a blast media that has higher friability than the substrate. So if you flip that around and you use steel grit on something that's really thin and soft, now the substrate itself has a higher friability than the media itself.